The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural, social, and artistic explosion that took place in Harlem, New York, spanning the 1920s. At the time, it was commonly known as the New Negro Movement, named after the 1925 anthology by Alain Locke.
The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural boom in all sectors of arts, especially dance. African Americans had new freedom to go out and dance. With the growing culture of social liberty, many new forms emerged, especially the Lindy Hop. This was a revolutionary new dance that broke away from traditional European dances with proper form to a new style of acrobatic, explosive dance moves that were the early starts of the swing, jitterbug, bop, and boogie woogie dances later on. This was their way of expressing their own style and breaking the rules of dance, which was stiff and very structured. Their contributions would later become very popular in not only black culture, but mainstream white media, and became a dance craze on its own. They drew from traditional African dance, jazz, tap, and the complex Viennese waltz, and made their own versions. Social dancing became very popular, and social clubs began to spread and assimilate to mainstream culture. Many dancers formed bonds with jazz bands, and they would work together to break the boundaries of the arts together with the rebellious jazz.
The Harlem Renaissance was in full swing during the 1920s and 1930s, and Harlem had people flocking to the area to partake in the blooming rebirth of artistic and musical expression. James Van Der Zee was a renowned Harlem-based photographer known for his poised pictures capturing African American citizenry and celebrity, and found the inspiration for his best photographs during this time, specifically involving middle-class African American life. He started to develop a passion for photography at a very young age. As a young child, he learned piano, violin, and art, and by the fifth grade, Van Der Zee became the second person in town to own a camera. He took hundreds of pictures and developed them by himself. In 1906, Van Der Zee, along with his brother, moved to Harlem, New York. He soon became known for his detailed imagery of African American life and for capturing celebrities such as Florence Mills and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. By 1916, he had opened up his own Harlem studio, Guarantee Photo, which was later renamed GGG Studio after his second wife, Gaynella Greenlee. For decades, Van Der Zee would photograph Harlemites of all backgrounds and occupations. He took thousands of pictures, mostly indoor portraits, and labeled each of his photos with a signature and date, which would prove to be important for future documentation. As Van Der Zee once said, "Sometimes the photographs seemed to be more valuable to me than they did to the people I was photographing because I put my heart and soul into them." At the height of the Harlem Renaissance, yet another powerful photographer was Carl van Vechten, who picked up a camera and discovered the power the photographic portrait has over the photographer himself. Over the decades, his fascination with the medium remained strong, and he asked writers, musicians, athletes, politicians, and others to sit for him, many of them central figures in the Harlem Renaissance, whose accomplishments fueled not only the new Negro movement, but also transformed the broader American culture throughout the 20th century. These groundbreaking men and women included James Baldwin, Ossie Davis, W.E.B. Du Bois, Ella Fitzgerald, Athalia Gibson, Langston Hughes, Bill Robinson, Bessie Smith, and many more.
During the Victorian era, prior women wanted to make themselves appear older, but once the Harlem Renaissance emerged, women strove to look youthful. They mainly did this by wearing dresses that fit to their body so that they could easily dance and be active, as well as cut their hair short into a new, very popular bob style. Some Harlem Renaissance women's staple pieces were cloche hats, which were close-fitting bell-shaped hats and were often made of horsehair, flapper dresses with rhinestone embellishments, silk gloves, high-heeled shoes, pearls, and fur coats represented the epitome of Harlem Renaissance style. During this time, women became more risque, with their dresses being lighter and hemlines often above the knee. Josephine Baker is someone who was born in St. Louis, Missouri, and moved to New York during the Harlem Renaissance. There, she started her long legacy of being a fashion icon and performer. During the 1920s, it was quite common to wear multiple outfits a day. At the beginning of the 20th century, ready-to-wear clothing made its first appearances. Before then, people had to go to a seamstress for them to make their clothing. French blue, green, and light orange were common colors of this era.
Melville Herskovitz published The Myth of the Negro Past in 1941, which became an inspiration for many other African American writers during the Harlem Renaissance. Many African Americans who had ancestors that were slaves felt that they didn't have many ties to Africa, with poets like Phyllis Wheatley writing about being rescued from those lands. Others, however, saw Africa as a place to return to and embrace, as Martin Delany and Alexander Crummell traveled to and worked in Liberia, with Crummell spending 20 years there as a priest and writer. Writers like W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in opposition to people like Booker T. Washington, who thought that blacks should simply accept their inferior status and try to assimilate into white society. While being black was still devalued by white people, black poets and writers started to place Africa at the center of black culture, showing it as a part of history and as something to be proud of. In the 20s, black writing became much more romantic, with those like Langston Hughes claiming African identity and writing more from imagination and literature knowledge than real facts. The idea of the innate goodness of humanity without being corrupted by civilization was prominent during the period and was seen not only in black writing, but by writing by white authors too. Langston Hughes wrote about his immense appreciation for black women and the beauty of black people overall, and had a strong assertion that blacks had played an important role in history, which was rather daring for his time. His poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, showed this assertion and is one of his most famous poems. County Cullen's poem Heritage is similar to Hughes and has the notion of light versus darkness, education versus illiteracy, mind versus body, etc., which were present in many works during the Harlem Renaissance. A lesser-known poet, Gwendolyn Bennett, echoes Cullen and Hughes in her writings of the beauty of black women, such as in her poem To a Dark Girl. Her writing challenged the negative view of black women that was created by slavery in America.
The abundance of emerging art and culture during the Harlem Renaissance was most clearly defined by the strong presence of African American music, mostly in the form of jazz. The Renaissance was known for its jazz music, largely because of the cultural exchange between black and white artists, and because of the new recognition and popularity which African music received on a widespread scale. This shift reflected a new acceptance of African American culture, especially by the younger generation, who were known for being the spark of the Roaring Twenties. Jazz music had been a staple of African American culture for a long time and had evolved from other forms of black folk music, which had been ignored and shunned largely by white culture up until this point in American history. Similar to shifts in fashion and dance, music reflected the increasingly casual, risque, and youthful culture that became increasingly popular during the Harlem Renaissance, both for African Americans and whites. Improvisation was a large part of jazz music, changing normal ideas about the format of music in America. More traditionally white styles of music were abandoned by the younger generation of white Americans, and African American music was more prominent throughout the nation, giving black music a platform on a larger scale for the first time. Black music was gaining acceptance. This trend of jazz meant no two songs would ever be the same, which paralleled the youthful spirit of the 20s. Artists such as Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, and Billie Holiday all entered the jazz scene and drew large crowds, playing songs such as Take the A-Train and Summertime. Harlem was an epicenter for music. Jazz clubs furthered this culture, as they became a social gathering place and allowed black and white cultures to mix because of their mutual appreciation of jazz music. The popularity of African American music sparked a revolution for African Americans across the nation. Conditions were dreary for blacks still, especially in the Deep South, and the music of the Harlem Renaissance allowed the black community the opportunity to be seen as a valued part of society in the early 20th century.
The signature artist of the Renaissance was Aaron Douglas, who turned away from traditional landscape painting after moving to New York City from Kansas. Influenced by Art Deco, the flat profile designs of ancient Egyptian art, and what he called the abstract qualities of spirituals, Douglas created his own style of geometrical figural representation and dealing with Negro subject matter. His stylized, silhouette-like rendering of recognizably black characters, imbued with qualities of spiritual yearning and racial pride, became closely identified with the Harlem Renaissance. In his illustrations for James Weldon Johnson's book, God's Trombones, Douglas transformed white Christian iconography by putting black subjects in central roles and evoking the identification of black Americans with the suffering of Jesus. In the 1930s, he turned more specifically to the collective historical experience of African Americans. His work subtly inflected with new Marxist orientation, as in his well-known mural series, Aspects of Negro Life. As Douglas said, our problem is to conceive, develop, establish an art era, not white art painting black. Then let's sing it, dance it, write it, paint it. Let's do the impossible. Let's create something transcendently material, mystically objective, earthly, spiritually earthly, dynamic. Yet another flourishing artist of the time was Lois Milo Jones. Lois Jones attended the School of Museum of Fine Art, Boston, during a time of strong discrimination against African Americans. She entered her works into exhibitions that did not recognize African American artists by having white friends deliver the paintings. In other cases, prizes awarded to her were taken away and given to her white competitors. Despite these challenges, Jones prevailed as an artist. Jacob Lawrence was the first mainstream African American artist. His success began at the age of 24 and lasted until he died in 2000. Lawrence is best known for his Migration series, where he shows the migration of blacks from Africa to the United States. The series focuses mainly on their history in the South. Throughout his life, he won many awards and a lot of recognition for his works.